Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's time for lesson 3 in semester 2 in psychology. And this week we're going to be talking about psychological testing. So one of the elements of the science of psychology is we have to gather data, and the way that we gather data is often test to see how people respond and behave and can be categorized. So that's going to be the conversation that we're going to have this particular lesson on psychological testing. And for a spotlight, kind of a connected type situation, we're going to talk about something called the savant syndrome. Savant is a term meaning somebody who is above the norm. It's a French word. And we're looking at something that is kind of an odd combination of brilliance and difficulty in terms of social relationships and sometimes mental acuity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I have a picture here of the movie Rain Man. If anybody's ever seen that, the Dustin Hoffman character, who is the Rain Man, is a person who suffers or has this particular syndrome, savant syndrome. And so if you kind of keep that in your back of your mind, if you've seen that movie, it'll give you an idea of what we're talking about here. If you haven't seen that movie, go see it. It's an amazing, amazing movie and gives a good insight into people with this particular disability. So a savant syndrome sufferer is a person that has mental disabilities but has incredible cognitive abilities that far exceed the normal person. So in certain areas, they are incredibly, as we would define it, smart or capable beyond what we would think is normal. And yet in other areas of their lives, they really suffer because of these mental disabilities. About 50% of the people that have savant syndrome also have autism. We've talked about autism before, and that's a processing disorder. And so we see a connection between these folks, the savant syndrome people, and also folks with autism. So the ability is characterized, or the disability is characterized as deep but narrow in focus. So this brilliance that they have is well beyond the norm, but it's very, very narrow. So it might manifest itself in one of the following areas. They might be a brilliant artist, or a brilliant musician, or have incredible mathematic or calculation abilities. And in the movie, that's what the Rain Man has, is the ability to calculate at an incredible rate, and spatial skills. So in those areas, or one of those areas, the person might be beyond brilliant, but in most other areas, they suffer at lower than normal functioning. So it's an interesting concept, and we're still looking into this, but it certainly is connected with this concept that we're talking about this week. All right, so let's talk about tests in general. And I'm not just talking about psychological tests here, but any test that you would take. A standardized test. We're getting ready to do the proficiencies here pretty soon, so it's all on most of our minds. And let's talk about what are some elements of a test. Well, a test, first of all, is designed to find out a lot in a short amount of time. That's why we test you. We say, all right, we want to see if this person knows math, or this person knows about the Civil War, or this person knows about the water cycle, or whatever it is. And so rather than going through a long, laborious conversation with you, we ask you some pointed questions, and then based on that, we can evaluate your knowledge. A test has a number of different elements that we need to make sure are there, or the test is no longer a functional way to gauge your ability. So it's got to have something called reliability. Reliability means it's consistent. If you take the test 10 times, your score should be, and you didn't do anything in between, your score should be pretty consistent. You might have a difference, one question here or one question there, but if the test is well constructed, it should measure you about the same every single time. The test should also have what's called validity, and that means it measures what it's supposed to. If you are anticipating going in and you've crammed for a test on, we'll use the Civil War as an example, and I plop down information on the Cold War, you're probably not going to do very well. And you're going to say, well, this test doesn't measure what I studied. We studied the Civil War, we didn't study the Cold War. And so we would have a test validity problem. And then finally, tests should have what's called standardization, and that is that norms or average scores when given to a large number of people. Standardization is what all big tests have. The proficiencies do. So when you have a particular score that you have to meet, 300 or whatever, 7 on the writing, whatever it may be, those are standards. And that we know that kids are going to be able to hit those numbers, and that number stands for something. That can happen with large tests given to large amounts of people. So if we talk about tests and then we talk about intelligence, because ultimately we want to test to see what intelligence is as part of our psychological testing, let's define intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to do a number of things. One is to acquire new ideas, to acquire new behaviors, or adapt to new situations. So a person or even an entity that has those abilities is thought to have some level of intelligence. There's a number of different theories of intelligence and how intelligence works. We're going to talk about two of them. One of the older ones is what's called the two-factor theory, that intelligence in humans is made up of a combination of general intelligence. These are things about your everyday world and how to do things and interact with people and interact with your world in general, and specific abilities. That's your intelligence in compartmentalized things. So your ability to do math, or your ability to be a carpenter, or your ability to rebuild an engine, whatever it might be. Those are specific intelligences. And so the combination of these general and specific abilities is, in the two-factor theory, what your overall intelligence would be. A fairly recent theory is called the multiple intelligence theory, and that is, we're going to talk about more in just a second, but that is the idea that our intelligence as a human being is made up of about 8 unique traits or characteristics that all together make up your intelligence. So let's talk about what those traits are and what this theory is. So the theory of multiple intelligence is fairly new. It really has only been around for about the last 30 years or so. Developed by a psychologist named Howard Gardner. And it was really designed to try to figure out what's going on with young people as we learn. It's a theory of intelligence, but also of learning too. And it recognizes 8 specific types of intelligence. And he's right now playing around with a 9th as well. So at this time, it's 8. It could be 9. It could be more as he kind of tweaks his theory. And the idea is that each person has different strengths in each area. So we'll take a look at what those 8 are in just a second, but some of those, when I talk about them, you're going to say, oh yeah, I'm really good at that, and others are going to say, oh, I'm a mess at that, I can't do that at all. And so this combination of where we fit on all 8 intelligence makes up our ultimate intelligence profile, would be what Howard Gardner would suggest. Critics of his theory suggest that it's not intelligence, but it's a measure of talent. So intelligence is something innate, something we're born with. Talent is something that we have an ability to do. So, you may be really good at rebuilding an engine in your truck. Is that intelligence or is that just a talent? So that's the critique of this particular theory. But I think as we go through it, you're going to say, this makes sense because I see myself in different areas. So let's talk about what those are. In the theory of multiple intelligence, this is, like I said, there are 8 different things, and we're just going to start with the red piece of pie here and kind of work our way clockwise. So we'll start with, the first one is linguistic. That's being word smart. That's if you have a propensity for languages. You can pick up languages well, you understand, you have a big vocabulary, you probably have a linguistic intelligence or a high measure of linguistic. There's logical mathematical intelligence, and just like it would say, that's you're smart logically. And math, things that are logically based make sense to you. You can probably do puzzles really well that are logic puzzles and things like that. There's the naturalist, and that is that you're nature smart. You kind of understand how the world connects and works together ecologically. Earth science and ecology are probably of interest to you. There's spatial intelligence, and that's picture smart and also kind of your place in the world. So this might be that you're a good artist. It also might mean that you're a good geographer, that you have kind of a good idea of how things are laid out and you understand where things are. So you're not lost a lot if you have spatial intelligence generally. There's bodily kinesthetic. Bodily kinesthetic is that you are smart in terms of your body. So you probably have some athletic ability here, maybe a dancer, things like that. You are in tune with your body and the physical nature. You probably love PE. There's musical intelligence. That's you're smart at music. Pretty self-explanatory there. You probably either enjoy writing or delivering music in some way. Interpersonal is that you're people smart. Interpersonal is generally that you are good at developing relationships. Socially, you feel comfortable. You like being in big groups. You probably like going to parties, all that kind of stuff. That's an interpersonal intelligence. And then there's intrapersonal, and that means you're good at thinking about yourself. So you're introspective. You probably are a deep thinker. You're asking questions about why am I doing this? Who am I? Things like that. So all those different little 8 pieces of the pie make up a person. And we have abilities or lack of abilities in all those areas. And so if you take a look at this for just a second, you could probably say, oh, okay, I see myself in these 2 or 3 pieces of the pie here. And then there's a couple others that you say, oh, geez, I'm really not very good at that. And that's exactly what Gardner would say. Moving on to an additional test, which is kind of a standard, is the IQ test. IQ stands for Intelligence Quotient. And this is a test that is formally known as the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale. And it was developed by a guy named Binet, and it was developed at Stanford, so now we figure out why it's called that. It is a measure of basic intelligence. So this is a test that was designed to predict a child's success in school, ultimately, is why they constructed this. And they have a normed score of 100. So right down the middle, absolutely average is 100 on this particular scale. So if you have a score of greater than 100, that means that you are smarter than the average person that's taken this test. If you have a score that's less than 100, then it would suggest that you have an intelligence that's a little bit below the average. And you can see from the graph here kind of where people fit. Most people are in the middle, somewhere between probably about 80 and 120 on the scale, and right in the center is 100. The folks that would be called very, very high on the IQ test would be over to the right of the scale, and the folks that would be considered low would be on the left. This is a test of verbal and nonverbal reasoning. So it's a lot of puzzles, it's a lot of activities, it's a lot of word play. That's what this test measures. Now remember, this is designed to see if a student will do well in school. So the test questions are designed for that. The critics suggest that, well, we have lost focus in terms of this, and so when we talk about IQ, we think of it as something kind of this general number. Are you smart? Are you not smart? And we don't realize, or we forget anyway, that it is designed to measure one particular type of intelligence. So just because you have a score that might be lower than 100 does not mean you're not incredibly talented. It just means that in this particular battery or this particular measure, you might be lower. So the IQ test is one of those. We'll take a look at an IQ test in this lesson, and you'll have a chance to go through it. It is very controversial, and it is a broad measure at best, and then nothing more than that do we want to take probably away from the IQ test. And I said, here's the IQ testing controversy. So people would debate, is this a true representation of intelligence? One of the things that it doesn't check for is the environment and the heredity. And those both have impact. We talked about that early on in this course. Both have impact on intelligence, but are not considered in the testing. So let's say that you have been in an environment where books are not available, your family doesn't value education, you've been moved around a lot, you've been out of school, whatever. Any of those factors would tend to suggest that you're not going to do as well on this particular test, but those aren't taken into account. It also is criticized for having a cultural bias, and that is that people of different cultures other than the dominant American culture, and you can read that, the dominant white American culture, do not do as well as maybe others would. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans, those type of folks that have a different experience might be biased away from the way that the questions are worded. And that can happen in all tests. It's not just unique to the IQ test. We have to be very, very careful when we're constructing tests, especially these big standardized tests like the SAT or the proficiencies, to make sure that they're not culturally biased. So let's talk about types of tests, specifically psychological tests, but tests in general. The first type is what's called aptitude. And an aptitude test is designed to measure the talent that somebody has, general talent, built-in talent, and predict the ability to learn new skills. So I'm not interested necessarily in the exact facts that you know. I'm trying to predict your ability to learn. There are general and specific aptitude tests. We do general to figure out your general abilities or prediction of your general abilities, and specific in tightened areas. So a couple examples that you guys probably know. One is the SAT. The SAT test is an aptitude test, and it's designed to predict your success in college. So, it's a little harder to study for because it is really designed to predict, as opposed to designed to know if you know exactly how to do this particular issue or know this particular fact. The ASVAB test that many of you probably took recently is also an example. That's the Armed Services test, and the Armed Forces want to know when they bring in a new recruit, what is this person good at? What are their talents? And so we can put them in the appropriate place. So those are aptitude tests. The next type is achievement tests. Achievement tests are the kind that you're used to mostly from college or from high school or any testing in school in general. So achievement tests are designed to measure what a person knows about a particular subject. So that when you take a chemistry test on the mole, for example, there's a topic in chemistry that I remember really well. It's going to be an achievement test. What did you know? What did you remember? What can you prove that you have the knowledge of? A good example that is more of a standardized test would be the advanced placement or the AP exams. Those are examples of achievement tests. They want to know exactly what you know in those particular topics. So if you took AP US History, the questions are going to be about AP US History, and they're going to be specific to that. They're not going to be interested in your ability to do well down the road. They want to know how much you know right this minute. Those are achievement tests. There's also interest tests. Interest tests are designed to measure a person's preference or their interests. So if we're trying to figure out what you might want to do in the future, what kind of careers or colleges might be of interest to you, you're probably taking an interest test. And you've undoubtedly taken one of those at some point in your academic career. We give those to you a lot because it gives us as educators and you as the student a really good idea of a path. So if you know that, wow, I'm really interested in architecture, that's what I want to do, and the inventory test or the interest test suggests that that's true, then we can kind of give you a path that has the right courses for you to be successful in that. So that's an interest test. And the last type of a test, or the second last, I guess, is going to be what's called personality tests. Personality tests are both objective, that means that they require you to answer a particular question, multiple choice test, for example, and projective, which means you can answer it any way you want. It's open-ended. But personality tests are designed to measure how do you decide things, what's your decision-making process and abilities, how do you do that in a social situation, what are your ideas related to responsibility, what are your ideas related to tolerance. So they're really looking at kind of how you are built as a person, your personality. And those can be very effective in terms of knowing how you're going to respond in certain situations. So these tests evaluate personality, and it also will let you know what people you connect best with, people that have a similar personality, and what people that you're maybe going to struggle with in life or in the career field or whatever, those people that have the, kind of the exact opposite. And so it gives us an idea of how to interact with people. These are very popular in workplaces. And a lot of times, a boss will ask all their workers to take this, and so we have a better idea of how we interact with each other in the workplace. All right, so now the last type of test is specific to psychology, and it's kind of a fun one. It's called the Rorschach test, and there's an example of it over on the right. This is called an ink blot test. And what happens is psychologists and psychiatrists, and it's not as popular as it used to be, but it's an open-ended test designed to get kind of an insight into a person's mind and thinking. And so what they do is they have these ink blots, and an ink blot is exactly what you think it is. Somebody plunks down some ink on a piece of paper, you fold the paper, the ink goes splatting around, you open the paper, and there's this blot of ink. Now what the psychiatrist does is then asks the person, the subject, to describe what they see. So obviously there's nothing there. It's a random ink blot. There's no right or wrong answer, but the interaction that the person has and how they describe what they see can give the psychiatrist a lot of information about who they are. So for example, in looking at this ink blot, you might say, well, I see two birds, one on the right and one on the left with their wings out. I see a frog in the middle. I see a face, whatever you wanted to come up with here, and you can probably find 8 million of these things in this particular blot. Then the psychiatrist would ask questions to follow up on that. There is a system to interpret the answers, and it gives a little information about the person. There's a lot of criticism about this particular test, which is why it's not done as much anymore, because it's very random, and you can say anything, and it really doesn't, if I say two birds flapping their wings, does that mean I'm going to be a mass murderer? Well, hopefully not. It's hard to interpret this and know exactly what's going on. It's more of a conversation starter than anything else. And as long as it's dealt with in that capacity, then it's probably an effective test. Okay, so that's some of the information about psychological testing, kind of a fascinating subject. And in this particular lesson, once you get done with your reading, we're actually in the case study going to take a look at several of these tests. We're going to have a multiple intelligence test. We're going to have a couple of Rorschach tests. We'll have a intelligence quotient test, an IQ test. We'll have a number of different things you can look at and get an idea of how these things work. Okay, so thank you much, and we'll see you next time.